Today we're going to first be talking about the world of the late Bronze Age. We already talked about last time how in the period from roughly about 1600 to about 1200, 1100 BC, so a period of about 500 years or so, known as the late Bronze Age. It was a period when all the lands of the western or the eastern Mediterranean Sea and the Middle East. So we're talking about what is today places like Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and also you can include Greece as well. All these areas in these lands that many of them border the eastern Mediterranean Sea, they all were experiencing a time of great economic prosperity, of trade, and of apparently strong population growth. It was a very prosperous time in the history of that particular part of the world. And it was at this time that Egypt, under the New Kingdom, Egypt was the mightiest country in the world at that time, the great superpower of the day. Now, this was a time when there was a great deal of interaction, and we see a lot of commonalities in terms of religion, in terms of economic systems. They all had that kind of palace system we've discussed already that we first saw in ancient Sumeria, where the palace or the temple serves as a kind of an economic and political center and place where goods are collected and redistributed. And they all were engaged in diplomatic relations with one another. Akkadian cuneiform was the diplomatic language of the day. Even Egyptians wrote, when they wrote letters to other monarchs, wrote them in Akkadian cuneiform. So there was, and the aims of war were very similar. So when nations went to war with their Bronze Age armies, it was about winning economic rights, trade privileges, or mainly about collecting tribute from subject states. But at the same time, if you were to do a survey of all the different civilizations of the late Bronze Age, you'd find that each civilization had its own very unique aspects. So you had this situation where you had a lot of interaction, a lot of commonality, but at the same time you had very distinct civilizations in place in each of the different areas of the late Bronze Age world. Now, we're going to talk about these different countries. We're going to begin with looking at Egypt in the late Bronze Age. And then we're going to talk about these other great states, the Mitanni, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans and the Noans over in the Aegean area. We're going to talk about all these different civilizations and look at their unique aspects and their commonalities with other late Bronze Age civilizations. But what happened at the end of the late Bronze Age was beginning around 1200 BC, and for about a century or so, or maybe a little more than a century, all chaos broke loose. You had wars, you had migrations, great cities were destroyed, new peoples were on the move, coming in and settling in areas. It was a time of great turmoil. And it also corresponds with a major change in technology. Around the same time that the whole late Bronze Age world came crashing down was at the same time that iron technology was developed and being used on a larger and larger scale. And we'll talk about that. That was a big deal because the ability to take iron ore, raw iron ore, and process it into making what we would consider steel, making iron tools and weapons. That was a major technological breakthrough. And it corresponds with this time of great turmoil and war and migration. And as a result of this big major change in technology, that's why it's called the late Bronze Age, because immediately following the Bronze Age you have the early Iron Age. And what we see happening in the Iron Age is that in the ancient civilizations of the Near East, there emerged on the ruins of those late Bronze Age world, there emerged a series of great empires. And we're going to be talking about these empires. You had the Assyrians, you had the Neo-Babylonians or Chaldeans, you had the Persians. So you see the succession of great, powerful empires dominating the Near East during the Iron Age. Now the Iron Age is also important because we see the emergence of ancient Israel. And Israel was never a great power. It was never one of the dominant powers of the ancient world, militarily or economically, like Assyria or Persia or Babylon. But it's very important in world history because the religious beliefs of the ancient Israelites were the basis of two of the largest religions in the world today. Both Islam and Christianity take their fundamental beliefs from the ancient religion of the ancient Israelites. So even though they're not a big part economically or politically or militarily in the history of the ancient Bronze or the ancient Iron Age, ancient Israel is important to study because of their legacy, of their religious legacy, and the fact that the Bible, the Old Testament, that is the literature that comes out of ancient Israel, is has been very influential in shaping the world we live in, whether you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish. So those are some of the things we're going to try to get to today and probably finish up on Wednesday. All right, so we're going to begin by looking at Egypt. Now, we already talked about how Egypt was one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age, and they had their great army of chariots that was unsurpassed in the ancient world. And we talked about Egypt had its own kind of unique aspects, the Pharaoh being so powerful, being a god ruler. We talked about Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. I wanted to spend a little time talking about a very interesting king, Pharaoh, known to history as Akhenaten. He lived about 1350 BC. He was of the same dynasty as Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. He was of the 18th dynasty of pharaohs. The 18th dynasty was kind of the dynasty of pharaohs that were the predominant dynasty during the New Kingdom in Egyptian history. And now, the thing about Akhenaten was that he decided to initiate a major change in Egyptian life. He declared that all the other Egyptian gods should not be worshipped, that there's only one God that ought to be worshipped. And his name was Aton. And no other gods needed to be worshipped. There's only one God, and that God was Aton. Now, Aton he wasn't the sun god per se, he was the god of everything, but the sun was his symbol. The sun disk, the sun in the sky, was the symbol of Aton. And now what he did basically was declare that all the other temples in Egypt, all those temples with all their wealth, now belonged to Aton. He was the only god that was to be worshipped. And he even changed his name. His original name was Amen-Nemhat, which comes from the word Ammon, the god Ammon. And he changed his name to reflect his new religious beliefs to Akhenaten. You noticed he put Aton in his name. He was the beloved of Aton. And he also decided to move the capital from Thebes, that was so closely linked to the worship of Amun-Ra, the old god, and he decided to build a whole new capital for Egypt. It was built in between the north and the south, in the middle part of Egypt, and it was the city of Aton, of course, and today it's the site of Amarna. And archaeologists have found this city. Now, it's a city it was a huge city with huge temples to Aton, a huge palace, but it was never complete. It went, by the time Akhenaten died, and when he died, the city was abandoned, and the city was never finished. So it was this big unfinished project. So obviously he put a great deal of time into this project of shutting down all the temples, dedicating all the temples to one God, and this would be the first case of a state-sponsored monotheism that we know in world history. Now, he also even decided to change even the way the pharaoh was portrayed. Now, typically, the pharaoh was portrayed as a pretty solid guy. Here's your typical pharaoh. I mean, the way that the pharaoh was portrayed had not changed since 3000 BC. They're always portrayed as solid, powerful beings. Look at this. He's pretty buff. He's got some big old muscles, broad shoulders. Well, he decided to change. Look, this is a man. He's got like feminine. He's got the big old hips. He looks all kind of I mean, people even have speculated that he was a transvestite or something, because he looks like has both male and female features. But all the pharaohs were portrayed in this way. All the members of his family were portrayed kind of very strange, elongated necks, kind of feminine hips. Nobody really knows why. We can only speculate. But he had this whole new way of portraying the pharaoh, very different from the way that pharaohs were normally presented. Now, there's a lot of speculation about Akhenaten. What kind of person was he? What was he trying to accomplish? Now, some historians believe that he was like some kind of religious zealot, that he came to this conclusion there was only one God, and he was determined to use all of his power as pharaoh to implement this religion throughout his entire country and to push for the religion of a single God, the God Aton. Other historians have been a little bit more skeptical about his zealotry and have speculated that it was all about power, that the way he saw it, perhaps, was that the priests were getting too much power, that the pharaoh was becoming more and more just a military and political figure, and more power was in the hands of the priests, especially the powerful priest of Amun-Ra. So some historians have speculated that what Akhenaten was trying to do was to weaken the power of the priesthood and restore all of Egypt's religious focus on the pharaoh. Because according to Akhenaten, only the pharaoh had direct access to Aton. So basically the pharaoh was the link, everybody's link to Aton. You couldn't learn about God unless you went to the pharaoh. So some people have speculated that what he was trying to do was to try to reestablish the old link between the pharaoh being an object of worship as the only divine figure, as having a monopoly on divine power like they used to in the Old Kingdom. So some people have said he was trying to restore, even though monotheism was a radical idea at the time, he was trying to restore kind of like the pharaoh's kind of position as a religious figure, which had been kind of lost over time as the pharaoh became more of a military and political ruler, and more of the religious power was focused on the priests. Well, anyway, Akhenaten's experiment failed. In fact, you've heard of the tomb of King Tut. There's always been a lot of speculation, but now people think that King Tut was actually the son of Akhenaten, and that at some point in his reign, the whole religion was dumped, and he changed his name to Tutankhamun. He got rid of his original name, had the name Aton in it. He changed it, and the Amarna was abandoned, and the temples were restored to the old gods, and Amun-Ra was restored to his place as the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon. So when it was all said and done, the whole experiment was a failure, and Egypt went back to being its traditional polytheistic religion, and the pharaoh went back to being more and more of a political and military figure, while the priests of Amun-Ra gained more and more power and influence as a religious figure. So it was just a wash when it was all said and done. Now, one of the results of all this was this marked the end. Tutankhamun, King Tut, marked the end of the 18th dynasty, and the 19th dynasty was established, which was more including Ramses II, or Yul Brynner, as you know him if you ever watched the old, ever watched the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston. But I always think of Ramses II as Yul Brynner. But the 19th dynasty was a continuation of the New Kingdom, but the pharaoh was basically more and more a political military figure, and the priests of Amun-Ra continued to acquire power and influence and religious authority during the 19th dynasty. All right, so we looked at Egypt in the late Bronze Age. Let's talk about some other powers. Another great power were the Mitanni. Now, the Mitanni, their power base was what is today northern Iraq, what is today Kurdistan. And the Mitanni are interesting because they originally were Indo-Europeans. In fact, we know that they worshipped some of the same gods worshipped by the Aryans over in India. So they were an offshoot. Remember, one group of Indo-Europeans. The Aryans had invaded into what is today Pakistan from Central Asia. So it's believed that another branch of Aryans, the Mitanni, headed west and eventually settled in what is today northern Iraq and eastern Turkey. And we know that they were Indo-Europeans because they worshipped like the god Varuna. The god Varuna was a deity worshipped in ancient India, in Vedic India, during the days of the Aryans, and he was also worshipped early on by the Mitanni. Now, when the Mitanni settled in northern Iraq and what is today eastern Turkey, they intermarried and intermingled with the local population, the Hurrians. So the Mitanni were, over time, they lost their Indo-European language and spoke Hurrian instead, which had been spoken for centuries in that particular part of the world. Now the Mitanni were, what they did is they were famous for their chariots. Just like the Aryans who invaded India, the Mitanni were great horsemen and had great chariots. And the Mitanni, making northern Iraq and eastern Turkey their base, they were able, between 16 and 1400, to establish a very extensive empire that extended all the way from northern Iraq into what is today Canaan, or what is today Israel and Jordan and Syria. And the system that they set up was that you have the high king, the king of kings, of the Mitanni was located in northern Iraq. We're not really sure exactly where in northern Iraq the Mitanni base was located, but they set up subject states all over the ancient Near East. And what they would do is that all the Mitanni subject kings, who had their own little private armies of chariot drivers, they all were, in one way or another, vassals or subject to the great king. For example, it's believed that in the Old Testament that you hear about the Jebusites. The Jebusites were the ancient inhabitants of Jerusalem. Before Jerusalem was part of Israel, before it became the capital of Israel, it was the home of the Jebusites. And many historians believe the Jebusites were Hurrians and Mitanni. That a Mitanni ruler had set up a kingdom in Jerusalem that was subject to the great king of Mitanni, and that the Jebusites were Hurrian and Mitanni who had intermingled with local Semitic peoples to create these Jebusites that you hear about in the Old Testament. It's one of the earliest inhabitants of the land of Canaan before the ancient Israelites arrived. Now the Mitanni, they were very much a part of the Near East. In fact, we found a Mitanni city. The city of Nuzi is located in northern Iraq, and it's on the Tigris River, and it was one of the major cities of the Mitanni. We know it wasn't their capital, but it was a major city. And when you look at its inhabitants, they spoke Hurrian, they spoke Amorite, they used cuneiform as their language. So we can see that Mitanni would be an example, a great example of how we see so often in Mesopotamia of when a new people come in, they quickly adopt the culture and even the language of the area that they conquer. And that was certainly the case with the Mitanni. Now, the Mitanni are closely related to another Indo-European people, the Hittites. Now, the Hittites we've already mentioned. The Hittites, the great king of the Hittites, Mercilus, in 1600 BC, his armies advanced on Babylon and destroyed the city and brought down the old Babylonian kingdom that had been established by the Hammurabi. Now, what happened with the Hittites, though, is that after this great victory, the Hittite kings were always at war with one another. There were all kinds of dynastic squabbles. There was a lot of problems with succession to the throne. Who would be the next king? And so among the Hittites, there were civil wars, and that's one reason why the Mitanni were able to take advantage of the situation. And from 1600 to 1400, the Mitanni were the dominant power, and the Hittites, who were always fighting among themselves and having these dynastic battles, the Hittites were like a second-rate power and sometimes even subject to the Mitanni. Now, the Hittites are another example. They were Indo-European originally. So like the Mitanni, they're Indo-European. But what had happened is that they had intermingled and adopted the language, the local language. It was called Hatti. the language spoken by the peoples of central Anatolia, what is today Turkey. So a very similar situation to the Mitanni. Now, the thing about the Hittites, though, was that they were located in Hattusas. We have found their main capital. It's located in what is today central Turkey. And Hattusas was one of the great cities of the ancient world. It was the capital of the Hittite Empire. Now, the Hittites were able to eventually get over their wars among themselves. And by beginning around 1400, the Hittites were able to unite and eventually eclipse the Mitanni as the dominant power in at least in northern Iraq, Syria, and Anatolia. And so the Mitanni were replaced by the Hittites as probably the major rival power to Egypt in the ancient Bronze Age world. Now, what allowed the Hittites to finally kind of unite and to defeat the Mitanni and become a dominant power was that they found a way to get around their dynastic problems. The Hittites had a very unique institution. It's called the Pancus. Now, the Pancus historians have noted that the Pancus was the first case of what we call a representative assembly. Because the Pancus was all the great nobles of the Hittites. The Hittites, like the Mitanni, took great pride in their chariot warriors. These were the guys who drove the chariots. If you knew how to drive a chariot, it was like a hereditary occupation. They were like the knights of medieval Europe. The Mitanni and the Hittite chariot drivers were the great nobles and the great warriors of their day. And the Pancus was when the king would call an assembly of all the nobles and all the great warriors. And beginning around 1400 or so, what the Pancus did was one of the kings of his name was Telepenus, I don't know if you know that, but one of the kings of the Hittites issued what some people have considered to be the first written constitution in European or world history. Basically, what it said was, okay, from now on, if we have a dynastic problem and we don't know who's going to be the next king, instead of killing each other in a civil war, we're going to let the Pancus decide. And whatever their decision is, it will be binding on us all. So basically it was going to say, hey, we're going to have dynastic succession, yes, but if there's ever a dispute, instead of waging war against each other, we're going to have a vote. And all the great nobles are going to meet in the Pancus, and they're going to decide the issue. Another thing they decided was that if a great noble and a member of the royal family was ever accused of a crime, instead of just putting the guy to death and starting another war, they were going to give that guy a trial. And the Pancus was going to serve as the jury. So instead of a king ordering one of his rivals, or maybe a member of his family or a great noble, to be executed without trial, for the first time, under this new constitution issued by a king, for the first time now you would have the assembly of warriors deciding the fate of that great individual. Now, this is not universal human rights by any means, but it did establish this idea of a right to a jury trial, at least for nobles and great men of the kingdom. And it established a representative body, even though it wasn't representative, it only represented the interests of the great nobles, the great warriors. But nonetheless, there's a big difference between a Pancus making decision and the divine pharaoh issuing the rules of the Lord. There's a big difference, right? And it was significant in world history. Now the Hittites were a people, and you look at their culture and you can see a lot of commonalities with other ancient Bronze Age kingdoms. Hattusas had a great palace, and the palace was an economic center, just like other palaces that we've looked at, like in ancient Sumer or the great palaces of the Pharaoh in Egypt. So it was an economic center. And the Hittites had early on developed their own kind of hieroglyphic script for their language. But by the time we get to the end of the late Bronze Age, they had shifted over to using cuneiform. So cuneiform, originally used to write Sumerian, was now being used to write Hittite language, the Hittite language, And that's how we know that they spoke an Indo-European language. It was because we know how to read cuneiform. We can read and say, oh boy, this language sounds a lot like languages like French and English and German and other Indo-European languages. So the Hittites were a people who had a lot of commonalities with other peoples in the ancient world of the late Bronze Age. But we already saw, like with their institution of the Pancus, they had their own unique aspects. One area where they were, and this applies to the Mitanni, was in the world of religion. They were very, both the Mitanni and the Hittites had adopted much of the religion and mythology of the ancient Hurrians. The Hittites, like for example, among the Hittites and the Mitanni, the main god that they worshipped was Teshub. Here's a picture of Teshub with his big axe. He was always portrayed carrying an axe, and he was the god of storm. So very, very similar to Enlil or what's the dude over in Babylon? I'm having a mental block here. Anyway, Bel, yeah, or Marduk. That's it, Marduk. Bel is the same thing. Yeah, thank you. And an interesting thing about the Hittites is that another thing that was interesting about them was that they did not worship in temples. You know, we saw that in ancient Sumeria you had the big ziggurat. The Canaanites had the temple that would be, the temple that would eventually be like the temple that the Israelites would build in Jerusalem on a hill. But the Hittites didn't have temples. They worshiped their gods out in the fields, or there were sacred groves of trees, or if there was a very unique rock formation somewhere, that's where they would go and worship their gods. So they worshipped out in the open air. So that was very distinct. They also didn't have a distinct class of priests like we see in Egypt. They had diviners, they were called. They were closely attached to the royal family, but these diviners would be people who were specialists in winning the favor of the gods through secret rituals. Hittites were very much into big rituals, saying spells and doing certain things, doing certain rituals that would win the favor of the gods. They're also very deathly afraid of the spirits of the dead, and they were always having all these exorcisms. They thought that if there was any kind of disease or sickness, it was because some dead spirit, some ghost was bringing destruction and disease. So they had all these rituals by diviners that were intended to, get rid of these ghosts, to purify somebody so these ghosts would not attack. So they had, in the realm of religion, they had some unique aspects. Now the Hittites also had their own creation story. We talked about Marduk and the Babylonian story about how the world was created according to them. The Hittites created their own version of, and in their version, of course, the creator god was Teshub. Just like for the Babylonians, the creator god was Marduk. Now, in the Hittite tradition, Teshub was born inside this mountain god. He grew up within a mountain god named Kumarbi, who was portrayed as a giant mountain, not a mountain man, but literally a mountain that was a man, made of stone. And Kumarbi grew up in the stomach. I won't tell you how you get there; it's kind of gross. But he grew up in the stomach, and then he was able to defeat Kumarbi. He broke out of Kumarbi, killed Kumarbi, and then used his body to make the world. So the heavens and the earth were created from the body of this giant mountain, Kumarbi. So that was the story of creation according to the Hittites. So then Teshub, once he had created the world, he ascended to heaven and became the ruler of gods and men, the great god worshipped by the Hittites. One of many gods. They were polytheists, just like other religions of the region. All right. Now, another great civilization that emerged in the late Bronze Age was in the Aegean area, and that would be the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans of the Greek mainland. Let's see if I can get my map going here. All right, so this is a good map here. Kind of shows you the world of the late Bronze Age. You know, here's where the Hittites would be located in what would eventually be called Asia Minor, but this area was where the Hittites, the Mitanni were over here. Here's Egypt. Here's the land of Canaan and Syria here. And then when we talk about the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, they were right in this area. Here's the Aegean Sea. And the Minoans came from the island of Crete. And Crete would be the first civilization, first European civilization that we know about. And that would be Minoans. And the Mycenaeans would be located here on the Greek mainland. And in many ways, the Mycenaean civilization was built upon the foundation laid by the Minoans. So there are a lot of similarities and commonalities between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. But the Minoans were first, and they were located here in Crete. All right, now beginning around 2000 BC on the island of Crete, we begin to see the growth of these first great cities. Knossos being one of them. Now, at the center of these cities was a great giant palace. Now, by the time we get to the late Bronze Age, beginning around 1600 BC, on the island of Crete, you had a whole series of great palaces. Giant palaces. And many historians believe that these palaces served in the same capacity, the same purpose as palaces we've seen in the Hittites and in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. They're economic centers. And we know this because every palace had huge storage capacity, granaries and places to store oil and grain and other goods. They also had workshops for craftsmen who worked directly for the palace. So every palace would have nearby lots of like what we would consider industrial space, where you had workers mass producing goods for the palace. So an economic system on Crete that developed there was very, very similar to where we see in other parts of the world. Now, the Minoans also developed their own script, their own writing system that they used to keep records, and they kept their records on clay tablets, or on pots. So they used seals to mark their goods on their pottery, and they used clay tablets to keep records. So just like we saw among the ancient Sumerians, you must have had scribes in place to keep track of all the records, to keep track of who was paying what in taxes and kind, and what payments were being made to various employees of the palace. And now this script is called Linear A, for lack of a better name. That's what the archaeologists called it. And we don't really know yet what Linear A, what language it was. It has not been deciphered. Now, many people have noticed that Linear A has many similarities to the early script used by the Hittites. So there's some speculation that the language spoken among the Minoans had some relationship to that spoken in Turkey, among the Hittites. But we don't know. That's speculation. It hasn't been. There's no consensus as of yet. Now, the Greeks later in time, the Greeks who lived later on in history, they like to tell stories, myths about the gods and about the heroes, and the Greeks told stories about Crete and about a king named Minos. We get the word Minoan from King Minos. And now the stories about King Minos that the Greeks told show that a lot of times myths that a lot of times when you think of myth, you think, oh, that's just a made-up story. But a lot of times sometimes myths tell us a lot about history. Because they're a way of remembering something that happened many, many years ago. And they're stories that are passed down from generation to generation. It's kind of like, anybody ever played telephone? Where you tell somebody, whisper somebody's ear, and then the person at the end, tells it, and it's usually what you find out is what comes out at the end is like completely distorted from the way it was at the beginning. And some people say, but maybe that's how myths work, that a true story that is told and from generation to generation, by the time it gets to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 generations, it's completely changed and becomes something completely different. And I just want to show you an example. Now, according to the myths that the Greeks told, Minos was the son of Zeus, so he was the son of a god. Zeus was the main god worshipped by the Greeks. And the story of his birth was pretty miraculous. What happened was that Zeus fell in love with this maiden from Phoenicia, in what is today near Syria, what is today Lebanon. Fell in love with her, and he came to her as a giant bull. He came into, and so she thought it was this pretty bull. And so she started putting flowers in the bowl, and she said, I think I'm going to get on the bull. The bull's so nice. And so she gets on the bull. Well, as soon as she gets on the bull, shoots off and transports her all the way to the island of Crete, where they have relations, and then she gives birth to the son Minos. And so Minos was the son of Zeus in the form of a bull. And now, there's a lot of bull motifs in Crete. The palaces of Knossos are covered with beautiful frescoes, which show a lot of bull imagery. Scenes of people riding bulls. It's thought that every palace had, at the center of a palace, a giant courtyard where young people would ride bulls. And it was like a form of bullfighting. And so here again, see the links here? So we find these archaeologists find frescoes, bull horns everywhere. Everywhere you go on Knossos, the palace is decorated with bull motifs. Giant horns, like horns of a bull, paintings of bulls, statues of bulls. There's a lot of bulls going on in ancient Knossos. And then we have a myth that the Minos, the king of Crete, was born from Zeus in the form of a bull. Now it gets better. The Greeks told the story that how Minos had built this giant structure called the labyrinth. And in the labyrinth, there was a minotaur, a half man, half bull. Now the story was that Minos had offended the god Poseidon, or offended some god. So Minos' wife had fallen in love with a bull and had relations with it. And the result was the minotaur, half man, half bull, a monster. And Minos didn't know what to do with this monster, so he stuck it in this huge labyrinth. And now, at one point, he got mad at the city of Athens on the mainland. He accused them of killing his son, so he forced them to pay this tribute, where they had to send 7 maidens and 7 young men to the labyrinth, and they'd be imprisoned in the labyrinth, and eventually they'd be killed and eaten by the Minotaur. But one day, a hero named Theseus arrived, and the hero Theseus decided to free Athens from this terrible tribute. So he volunteered to go as one of these youths to be eaten by the Minotaur. But when he got to the labyrinth, he was actually the daughter of Minos saved him. She showed him how he could use thread so he wouldn't get lost in the labyrinth, so he could find his way back out. And he made it into the labyrinth, found the Minotaur, killed the Minotaur. See, here's a picture of him killing the Minotaur, half bull, half man. And then he escaped with the king's daughter and went back to Athens and freed the city. Now, these stories, the story of young people being forced to be eaten by a bull, that sounds a lot like all these images we have from the frescoes of Knossos showing young people fighting bulls. So there seems to be some kind of connection there. Another thing was that this is a bad day for me. I'm having all these senior moments here. Well, I was going to tell you something, man. I guess I got to start following my notes again. But anyway, where was it? Minos, the bull. Oh yeah. This is another thing. The labyrinth. Remember that they had those big palaces on Crete? And some people speculated that these palaces were the basis of the story of the labyrinth. Why do they think that? Well, okay, the word labyrinth means hall of the double axe. An axe being a double axe, two-sided axe. And all over the Palace of Knossos and then these other palaces that were built on Crete, you find depictions of a double axe. So basically, the basis of the story of the labyrinth is the palaces that were built on Crete by these rulers. So in many ways, you can see how a story that was told by the Greeks has some basis in fact, in the greatness of late Bronze Age Minoan Crete. Now, some people have looked at this myth and said, well, maybe this myth can tell us something about the ancient Minoans. Perhaps Minos was like Pharaoh, a title, and every king of Crete was the Minos, and maybe that was some kind of a hereditary title. Also, the Minos is the son of Zeus, and he's also, according to Greek myth, he's also one of the judges of the dead. When you go to Hades, the land of the dead, the Greeks believed that one of the judges who would sit in judgment on you would be King Minos himself. So he was considered to be a divine figure. So perhaps on ancient Crete, the Minos was not just a man; he was like the pharaoh, a religious figure. Now, the Minoans did not build temples either. Like the Hittites, they worshipped in caves, they worshipped on mountaintops, they worshipped in the fields. We know from their frescoes that decorated their palaces that they had priestesses and priests who offered sacrifices to the gods, on mountaintops or they found cave sanctuaries. So we know that they had this religion, but it wasn't focused on building temples, kind of like the Hittites. And also, another thing about their worship was many people have speculated that the Minoans might have worshipped nature to a large degree, because all their frescoes that decorated their palaces portray sea life like octopi and dolphins, and there's a lot of focus on the sea and on animals and creatures of the sea. And another aspect of the Minoan religion is that the main religious figures appear to be women, in the sense that a lot of the people portrayed in the frescoes, a lot of the people are women, and one of the main goddesses they worship is called the snake goddess. It's a goddess who's always surrounded by snakes. Now this image is found a lot. This idol was worshipped and honored and revered throughout Crete because they find depictions of a woman holding snakes almost everywhere among the ancient Minoans. So it's thought that they worshipped some kind of goddess that was associated with snakes and with the earth and maybe with fertility. They worshipped a bull, obviously, a lot of bulls going on in ancient Knossos in Crete. And they had a system where they didn't build temples. They had a lot of priests and priestesses worshiping outdoors and on mountaintops and in nature. But also we know that palaces served as religious sites, that there were sanctuaries built into the palaces. So the palaces where the Minos, the king, ruled were not just places, economic and political places of power, but also places of religious worship. And so perhaps the Minos, the king, was also a priest. And we've seen that in a lot of other cultures as well, where the king is both military and religious figure. Now, about 1550 BC or so, the palaces of Crete were all destroyed, just wiped out, burned and looted. It's believed that what happened is that people from the mainland came in, mainland Greece, and conquered Crete. Now, when they conquered Crete, we know that a new people had arrived because when these people came in, they rebuilt the palace at Knossos, and they built a couple other palaces. But they rebuilt the main palace at Knossos. But when they started writing, they still used clay tablets, but they used a different language, Linear B, it's called. So the fact that the new inhabitants of Knossos were writing in a new language shows that people had come in and conquered the Minoans, and they had been replaced. Now, Linear B is called Linear B because it looks a lot like Linear A. Now we know it's a different language because Linear B has been deciphered. And the thing about Linear B is it's ancient Greek. So the people who conquered Crete were Greeks, Greek speakers. And they adapted Linear A to their own language and used it to develop their own script called Linear B. Now, this culture of Greeks of the late Bronze Age is called Mycenaean because after 5215 BC, you start to see the rise of these major cities on the Greek mainland. And the largest and most powerful city was Mycenae. That's where we get the phrase Mycenaeans. Because Mycenae was by far the greatest of the cities of the Greek mainland. Now, there were a number of different cities, but Mycenae was the largest. And now the Mycenaean Greeks, they were very deeply and strongly influenced by Minoan civilization. So they adopted the Linear A script, they used it to write their own language in Linear B, but they built palaces, just like the Minoans had built. Now the big difference between a Mycenaean palace and a Minoan palace was that instead of having a big courtyard where you had bullfights like you find in Crete, among the Mycenaeans, the center of their palace was a big room called a megaron, a big room with a big hearth in the middle. Now, the Greeks told stories about the Mycenaeans. There was the Greek poet Homer tells us about he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in the Iliad, the most powerful of all the kings of ancient Greece was King Agamemnon of Mycenae. So again, we have another story where these stories that were told centuries later, after the late Bronze Age, they seem to have a basis in fact. So like in the epic poems of the Greeks, Mycenae is the greatest power. And the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon, is the greatest king of all the Greeks. And then we go back, we find out through archaeology that Mycenae in the late Bronze Age was the biggest, most spectacular of all the cities, with the biggest palace. And now, among the ancient, in the epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey, every palace where every king had a great central hall with a big hearth in the middle, where everybody would gather and they would hear stories and hear poetry, and that's where the king would hold court and hold justice. And look what would happen when we start to investigate these palaces built by the Mycenaean Greeks. At the center is a big megaron, a big room with a central hearth. So again, we see that epic poetry that was written down centuries later preserves a memory of what it was like in the late Bronze Age Mycenaean world. Now, another thing about the Mycenaeans was because we can read their language, we can learn something about them more than we know about the Minoans anyway. Now, the king, these tablets, these Linear B tablets, were used to keep records. They were just like we see in other parts of the world. You had to keep accounts of what taxes were paid in kind, who was getting what payments. You know, every palace had all these granaries and storage space, and had all these craftsmen working, and so you had to pay the craftsmen and the merchants payments, and you had to have people, scribes, to keep track of everything. And in the cuneiform, in the Linear B tablets, these are clay tablets, the king is the Wanax. And the Wanax, in later Greek tradition, the word Wanax was a way to describe a god. Not a man, but a god. So it means, translated means Lord, like Lord God, Wanax. And so the fact that the Mycenaean kings were all called Wanax makes you think if there was any kind of cultural continuity, these kings must have been regarded as more than just a man. Now, according to the Greek myths, all the ancient heroes were kings who were the sons of gods. They were all had divine origins. So that seems to suggest that in the ancient Bronze Age time, these great kings who ruled over these Mycenaean cities were viewed by the populace as more than just a man, just like the Minos, just like the Pharaoh in ancient Egypt. And now the one thing different, one of the big critical differences between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans is that if you go to in the heyday of the Minoans, there was very little fortifications at all. So that would seem to suggest that the line of Crete was united by one king, that all these palaces were, maybe there was a confederation of kings that were linked together, or that you had one overall king over all of Crete. And there's a tradition that the king of Crete had a great fleet. And we have evidence that the Minoans were great sailors, and they traded all over the Aegean. We found Minoan ports of call and trading posts all over the Aegean. So the Minoans, they prided themselves on their fleet, and they were united under a single ruler, it appears. But when you look at the Mycenaeans, every Mycenaean city was surrounded by massive, giant walls. Like, here are the walls of Mycenae. This is the great gate into Mycenae. These walls, I mean, a man is like this tall. I mean, these are huge, giant stone gates and walls. And the fact that every major Mycenaean city had major walls and fortifications suggests that what was life like in mainland Greece? You build walls for what reason?
Keep people out.
Keep people out. Protect, self-defense. So it's believed that the Mycenaean city-states were all ruled by kings who were not united, that waged war against each other. And that is certainly how they're portrayed in Greek epic poetry. Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, is the most powerful king, but he doesn't rule the other Greek city-states. In fact, the other city-states, the other kings of other states aren't afraid to challenge him. In fact, one of the stories in the epic, one of the basic stories, motifs in the epic of the Iliad epic, is the struggle between Agamemnon, the most powerful king, and another king, Achilles, who is one of the great heroes. So, and again, here again, we have poetry written centuries later that perhaps preserves some memory of actual events. In fact, they found Troy. The epic, the Iliad, tells the story about how the Mycenaean Greeks came together under Agamemnon and waged for 10 years a war against Troy. And archaeologists have found Troy. And it was destroyed by fire around 1200 BC, which was the time in which Greek historians dated the Trojan War. So again, there seems to be a correlation between events described in epic myth and the story of the Iliad and actual events that archaeology showed happened during the late Bronze Age. Now the destruction of Troy around 1200 BC marks the beginning of a period of a lot of wars and chaos in the late Bronze Age world. And this corresponds to the same time that iron replaced bronze as the main tool, the main material for goods, for weapons and tools in the ancient world. And that's why the end of the late Bronze Age also marks the beginning of the early Iron Age. All right. So what I want to do now is take a little break. But what I want you guys to do in your groups, you take a little break for a while, but I want you to get together in groups and think about this question: what would be the implications of iron? Okay, if you have iron, means you have the development of iron technology meant that you had more iron out there. I mean, bronze was hard to come by. There wasn't a whole lot of bronze. It was an alloy of tin and copper, and there wasn't a whole lot of tin and copper. There was a shortage of it. It was greatly revered. But once they learned how to take iron ore and make it into iron, I mean, there was iron everywhere. Iron was cheap. That meant, the development of iron technology meant that more and more people had access to iron tools and iron weapons. Now, so a whole new change in technology. So what I want you to think about, what would that mean? How would that change people's lives? How would that change how people live? The fact that now you could have these really good steel weapons and tools that more and more people had access to. And then I want you to think about something else. How does some new technology in your lifetime being more accessible? What does a cheaper iPhone mean to the world? Right? That's a new technology. Iron technology was a new technology. They learned how to take iron ore and make it into a tool, make it into a material that you could craft. A blacksmith craft into, like you see at Dollywood, could craft into tools and weapons. So what does that mean? How would that change people's lives? And how does technology in general, how can the fact that technology is more accessible to more and more people, like an iPhone or a smartphone, the fact that billions of people can now have smartphones, something that, that You know that a smartphone holds more data than the most powerful computer in 1950? I mean, the Pentagon computer of the 1950s that helped produce the hydrogen bomb had less data in it than the smartphone that probably some of you have in your pocket right now. That means, look at that, technology is more accessible than ever now. So that's a question. So think about iron, how that would change people's lives, and then think about how something like new technology can, when it's more accessible to more and more people, how it can change society. So I want you all to get in your groups and think about that. Maybe take a little break for a stretch, go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, and then think about that. So we'll give you about 5, 6, 7 minutes or so. And then I'll ask you guys some questions. You all water yourself? Oh, okay. How you doing? I you guys do some more decoration? What now? Oh, okay. Oh, with a tree. What? Oh.
I seen this in there, and I said, that can't be a student.
How you doing? You ready for more? Oh, okay. All right. Amber Davenport, right? Have you heard from Bob? He said he was going to Bob on Wednesday.
See, he wasn't here for last Wednesday.
Yeah. He told me what's going on. I just wanted to hear.
Well, yeah, I had a problem. I can show him my
Oh, they're still doing it. They haven't get any yet. Yeah. Actually, it's, well, the thing about iron is that iron ore is going to work a lot more. Well, they form use it. There's a process involved. more talent to use iron than sort of bronze. Yeah, really how y'all doing? No, the horses weren't invented that's why horses were never used for any labor. They were only used for like and to gain access used to use oxen actually for wagon for horses. Yeah, they didn't stir Hey, all doing today, guys? You guys can you hear my good idea? Hey, all doing all right, guys. Let's see what you guys got. What would be like if we talked about iron being introduced at the end of the Late Bronze Age? What would be some of the implications of iron for culture, society in general? What do you guys got?
Trade.
Well, I mean, yeah, they could trade bronze too, though. More than just trade. What else? Yeah.
I think it'd be around the first time you start seeing a middle class, because you'd have people who are able to afford to equip themselves, like arm themselves, the same as the nobles are able to.
Well, yeah, you'd have, that would be true. You'd be able to, more and more people would have better tools. You know, instead of just, it used to be during the Bronze Age, most of the typical person, they continued to use stone tools because they couldn't afford bronze. But now you can everybody can have an iron axe. Think about that. Everybody can have an iron axe, and so there'd be more wealth being produced because more people would be more efficient tools. What else you guys got?
Well, in America a few years ago, the man actually died. There was a swordsmith named Paul Champagne. He lived in the mountains, and he could actually go out and find his own iron ore, and then he would make it into steel. So it was very simple to get a hold of, and then make it into iron weapons rather than having to alloy copper and tin. So you just take your ore, melt it down, smelt it.
So you had technology that you didn't have to be, and it was more accessible. Anybody could do that, right?
Right.
So what if like more people can have access to weapons? What does that do if you're a warrior elite? What happens if in the Bronze Age you had these warrior elites? We have the bronze. We're the elite warriors. But now, hey, anybody can go to the mountains, make your own iron sword. What is that going to do to the warrior elites? What? They're not going to be that special anymore. They're not special. Yeah, you got your bronze sword. Hey, I got an iron sword. Screw you. More and more people, and more and more people means what about armies? Do armies get bigger or smaller? Bigger. And you can recruit among the young, poorer people, right?
So are smaller militias too, like.
Yeah, you can. A bunch of poor people could say, "Hey, we got iron ore weapons. Let's go kick some ass. Let's go raid and pillage. Let's go take, screw these elites. We don't need them anymore. We have the weapons now. We can do what we want." Just think. I was just thinking, we were making fun of this years ago about Osama bin Laden and the cave, but he had a smartphone, didn't he? Mm-hmm. You get on a smartphone, he could tell all those little guys to go out and bomb this and kill that. So some Arab guy in the middle of nowhere who's a terrorist, a jihadist, he can, with his smartphone, he's just as capable of ordering a hit as a Pentagon chieftain. So technology today levels the playing field, just like technology 3,000 years ago leveled the playing field. So, there's talk about smart bombs. You can take a guy with a suitcase with could have a nuclear weapon that could, a dirty bomb that could make radioactive a whole city. He could carry it in his suitcase. So Osama bin Laden, well, he's dead now, but whoever his successor is, got on his little smartphone, implement Plan B, and they could take their little suitcase full of radioactive bomb, kills 1 million people in New York City. It could happen, and people are worried about it. So technology, double-edged sword, man. Hey, that's a little play on words like that, sword, double-edged sword. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. And more and more, iron tools were a great thing for a guy. Iron axe, hey, I can chop down trees faster than my old stone axe. So you're more productive, so it's a great thing, boosting the economy. But it also means that some yahoo who's got an iron sword, a bunch of yahoos can form a militia and raid and pillage and kill and create havoc. Whereas just the Bronze Age, that would be less of a possibility. So those are some of the implications of iron. All right, now the collapse of the late Bronze Age world corresponds with the shift from bronze to iron. And some people even speculated that iron was a cause of disruption, like exactly what I just happened. People say, hey, I got iron weapons, let's go and cause a war. People who were poor, with iron weapons, they could go out and wreak havoc and become pillage and rape and kill and do whatever they wanted to do. So some people even speculated that the collapse of the Bronze Age world had a lot to do with iron technology. And what you see happening is across the late Bronze Age world, you had these nomadic groups, people from the mountains or from the desert, with iron weapons now coming upon the scene and taking over these cities and sacking them and creating all kinds of disruption. For example, according to Greek tradition, a Greek-speaking people called Dorians who lived up in the mountains of Greece, they came down and conquered the Mycenaean cities. The great cities of the Mycenaean tradition and the epic tradition. These great cities were all brought down, and mainland Greece was all conquered, or much of it, not all of it, but a good bunch of it was conquered by the Dorians. Now, some people have argued that these myths of the Dorians reflect the fact that maybe Greek-speaking mountain people who were on the margins of the Mycenaean world, maybe came out of those mountains and decided to raise some cane. And we know that in the period from 1200 to 1100 BC that there was a lot of destruction. Cities were wiped off the earth, and there was a lot of death. Now, there's also some evidence of some major earthquakes. So it might have been a combination of earthquakes and human destruction and wars. But many people think that perhaps mountain peoples, maybe from a simple culture, mountain peoples came in from the mountains of central and northern Greece and occupied much of Greece and raided and pillaged. And they were a factor in destabilizing the entire area. So the Mycenaean civilization comes collapsing down, comes crashing down between 1100 and 1200 BC. Now, in Greece, the destruction of the Mycenaean cities meant the destruction of complex culture. Writing disappeared, cities disappeared, and all of Greece reverted back to a more simple culture for a period of 300 years. It's called the Greek Dark Ages. And it would only be in the 8th century that there would be a revival of complex cultures called the Renaissance of the 8th century. So one result of the late Bronze Age collapse in the Aegean world, in the Aegean world, was that it completely destroyed, for a period of centuries, the complex culture that had developed there. And all that would be left would be these traditions and stories passed down from generation to generation by poets like Homer. And that's the basis of the epic traditions of the Greeks, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, it is believed that problems in the Aegean area, wars and migrations, might have had a, what do you call it when you throw a rock into water? Ripple effect. Yeah. Having a senior moment again. Ripple effect. And so many people think that people from the Aegean area, maybe fleeing war and chaos, began to expand into other parts of the Mediterranean, looking for new places to live, to escape war and migration and destruction. And in all the records of Egypt and Syria and the Hittites, you hear about the sea peoples. the sea people. And they're people from the sea, people from the islands, from the Aegean area, coming in, raiding and pillaging and settling in new areas. One of the most famous of the sea peoples were the Philistines. Now, the Philistines are in the Bible. But the Philistines, many people think their original home was probably in the Greek area, in the Aegean area. And that at the close of the late Bronze Age, they were one of the groups of sea peoples who came in, and what happened was that they fought against the ancient Egyptians, the pharaohs, and the pharaohs couldn't defeat them, so the pharaohs gave them a bunch of territory in what became the land of the Philistines, and what is today Gaza, and that area, you've heard of the Gaza Strip, we're having all those problems today. Well, Gaza was the land granted by the Egyptian pharaohs to the Philistines at the close of the late Bronze Age. So they're probably the most famous of the sea peoples. But we hear about sea peoples burning and pillaging and raiding all over the eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age. Now, another group of people were known to the Egyptians as the Libyans. Now, it's believed that the Libyans and the sea peoples together defeated the Egyptian pharaohs. And a lot of Libyans, these were nomadic peoples from the deserts of Libya, from the east of Egypt, and that these Libyans came in and settled in northern Egypt. And what happened as a result of these raids by the sea peoples and by the Libyans was that the new kingdom came crashing down. And for the next several centuries, Egypt would be disunited. So one of the casualties of these migrations and wars was the new kingdom of Egypt. They fell victim to raids by sea peoples and by Libyan tribesmen to the east. Now it's believed that the Hittites may have also played a role in destroying the Hittite power in the eastern Mediterranean, but also we see migration of people from the Balkans. The Phrygians were believed to originally inhabited what is today Bulgaria and the Balkans, and they crossed over from Eastern Europe into Turkey, into Asia Minor, and they settled in much of Central Asia Minor. So here again we have another example of migration of people moving into new territory and creating lots of disruption. Now, another group of people we hear about were the Aramaeans. So the Aramaeans were a Semitic people, like the Amorites, like the Arabs of today. They were Semitic people. And Aramaean means literally wanderers. So the Aramaeans were originally, they were nomadic horsemen, and they raised herds. They were nomadic people living on the outskirts of the Mesopotamia, living out in the deserts on the outskirts of Syria and Mesopotamia. And at the close of the late Bronze Age, these Aramaic tribes were on the move. And these Aramaic tribes immigrated and settled in Syria and in Canaan and in Mesopotamia, and they settled among the people. And they settled in such large numbers that up until the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, Aramaic was the most common language spoken in what is in Mesopotamia and Syria and in the Holy Land. Of course.
So they were originally nomadic?
Yeah. Aramaean, the word Aramaean means wandering peoples. So they were actually, they were nomads. So what you see happening is that you see all these nomadic peoples on the move. Now, some people have postulated that another factor in the movement of all these people was climate change, because we know that at this particular time, things were actually, there was a cold streak, and there was drought. So they think that drought might have driven nomadic peoples in search of water and forage for their flocks into the more settled areas. They think cold weather might have drove people from the mountains of the Balkans and central Greece into finding new homes because of cold weather, freezing temperatures up in the mountains. So climate change, not getting warmer but getting colder, getting drier, might have been agent in creating these large migrations at the end of the late Bronze Age. Now, we got one more second and we'll get out of here. What we see happening is that, like I said, in the Aegean world, you can go to a simple culture for centuries. But as we'll see next time, what we see happening in the Near East is that you see on the ruins of the late Bronze Age world a succession of great Iron Age empires. And so we'll cover that on Wednesday. Yeah, get all your things in.
I'm a little bit more different now.
I see that. I like it.